Our job is to add in-depth analysis to one big question from the news. We hope you like it.
BBC World Service, this is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry, the programme that searches for answers to some of the world's most urgent questions. This week, with Islamic State militants on the outskirts of Baghdad, we ask, can Islamic State be defeated in Iraq? In the early hours of Monday the 6th of June, a fleet of pickup trucks sped across the desert towards Iraq's second largest city, Mosul. The trucks were packed with Islamist militants. They shot their way through checkpoints and entered the city. Sleeper cells hiding in the city sprang into action, seizing vehicles and weapons. The Iraqi army fought back, but not for long. The commanders were the first to flee, this soldier said. The city will definitely fall. He was right. After just 4 days of fighting, black jihadist flags flew high over government buildings. The city was theirs. Five months later, despite American-led airstrikes, Islamic State is terrorising the capital with car bombs and mortar rounds. So, can Islamic State be driven out of Iraq?
The terrorist group known as ISIL must be degraded and ultimately destroyed. There can be no reasoning, no negotiation with this brand of evil. The only language understood by killers like this is the language of force.
Part 1. The military solution.
I am the last person to want to get a war.
Our first expert witness is a man who knows a lot about successful military interventions, having led one of the more effective ones in recent history.
I'm General Lord Richards, much to my surprise now, and I was in the British Army for 42 years and had the privilege of commanding in the latter 15 years a number of operations, from some in East Timor, Sierra Leone, Afghanistan, and then I ended up as the head of the armed forces.
General Richards is probably best known for turning what was meant to be a simple evacuation of British nationals from Sierra Leone in 2002 into a full-scale military intervention. It helped end the country's decade-long civil war. He retired a year ago, his army uniform replaced by chinos and a checked shirt. But his advice is still sought by governments and companies all over the world. In fact, he turns up to the interview with suitcase in hand. So does General Richards think airstrikes can defeat Islamic State?
You might defeat some terrorists and kill a lot of terrorists that way, but whether that is defeating them, or let alone destroying them in the way we're now hearing people talk about, I'm afraid just can't be the case. My worry is that it's being viewed as a terrorist problem, whereas actually ISIS has now all the trappings of a state. From a military perspective, you have to view them as a conventional military problem. That means at some point you're going to need a land force to deal with it. My solution to that is you train an Arab army, and it doesn't have to be massive numbers, but you've got to have a land element.
This is no armchair general speaking. 2 years ago, he came up with a secret plan to train an army of 100,000 moderate Syrian rebels to fight Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad. At the time, General Richards' political masters deemed it too risky. Now, elements of this plan are being put in place, not to defeat President Assad, but to fight Islamic State. How do you go about recruiting for an army?
Well, in Sierra Leone, it was relatively easy, because if you offered them rice and a little bit of money, lots of good young men came forward to be recruited. But I think, sadly, in places like Syria and Iraq, the same principle applies, but you've got to add a moral component to it as well. And that's not difficult if they think by joining this army we're talking about that will defeat ISIS, they will be joining a successful organisation organisation which works, which feeds them properly, which looks after their families if they're injured or killed, then you quickly start to motivate people to fight beyond the immediate, which is probably merely for money and food.
But morale in the Iraqi army is in short supply. There are reports of Iraqi soldiers left on the front line for days without food. Years of corruption have undermined it. The Kurdish Peshmerga fighters may be more unified, but they can't defeat Islamic State on their own. And there's another problem.
If I was still advising the Prime Minister, and I have no reason to think he would seek my advice on anything, by the way, I would be emphasising the importance of a political accommodation with the Sunni tribes as the basis of a solution.
The same tensions between Sunni and Shia that have divided Iraq have weakened its army too. Decades of sectarian rule, with successive leaders favouring either the Sunni minority or more recently the Shia majority, has fuelled resentment on both sides.
The Iraqi army needs to be opened up and turned into a representative army in which Sunni and Shia can prosper on the basis of merit. At the moment, I don't think that is the case. And so launching them into Mosul or other areas that are predominantly occupied by Sunni tribes, I think is something you've got to be very careful about.
In answering our question, can Islamic State be defeated in Iraq, General Richards has brought us to the heart of the issue. The sense of betrayal felt by many Sunni Iraqis. It's even led some Sunnis to join IS. To better understand where that betrayal comes from, we're going back to 2003 with the help of our next expert witness.
Part 2. The Sunnis.
I arrived in Baghdad in June 2003, and so I was witness to what Baghdad looked like before really the insurgency went on to a high boil.
This is Ali Kaderi. He's been special assistant to 5 American ambassadors in Baghdad.
And then I saw the violence spiral out of control.
The insurgency began in 2003 after America disbanded the Sunni-dominated army. Sunni militants started attacking, not just occupying American forces, but Shia civilians too. Shia militias counterattacked, and into this chaos came Al-Qaeda. Tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians died in car bombs and illegal executions.
By 2005, Zalmay Khalilzad, the American ambassador, initiated talks with some of the Sunni insurgents, and that had been sort of a red line for the U.S. government for a couple of years at that point. But Khalilzad, who's originally from Afghanistan, understood that without reaching out to these disillusioned Iraqis, there was never going to be a military solution to the problem.
The Americans began secret negotiations with the Sunni insurgents who'd been fighting alongside the forerunner to Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, in Iraq.
And for about a year, these secret negotiations went on and gradually began to take root. And before we knew it, they had blossomed into what eventually became known as the Sunni Tribal Awakening, which was the Sunni Arab tribes in Iraq saying, we will agree to fight Al-Qaeda alongside the United States military. But in exchange, we want financing, we need training, we need military hardware, weapons. And the violence went down by 90%. So it was an extremely successful effort.
Today, citizens who once feared beheading for talking to our troops now come forward to tell us where the terrorists are hiding. And young Sunnis who once joined the insurgency are now joining the army and police.
That was 7 years ago. Now, things have changed. Trust between the Iraqi government and Sunni tribal leaders has broken down. Ali Kaderi blames this on the sectarian rule of the Shia-led government of then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. He says it alienated Sunni tribal leaders, making them more receptive to IS.
We betrayed the promises that we made to those tribal fighters. We said, turn your guns away from us, turn them toward Al-Qaeda, let's fight Al-Qaeda together, and in return we will provide you full American sovereign guarantees that we will reintegrate you into Iraq's political process. So they fought back Al-Qaeda. We defeated them together, essentially. And ahead of the 2010 elections, they formed the Iraqi coalition, and they won the elections. And then when Washington and Tehran agreed to support Maliki for that second term, not only did we disrespect Iraq's constitutional procedures, not only did we disrespect the elections results, but we again ensured that we had betrayed those promises and thus were going to reignite the insurgency, which the Sunni Arabs told us in advance. That they specifically told me in a meeting in Amman. They said, if you betray us once more, we will burn Baghdad, we will die trying, or we will take it. And that's basically what you've seen over the past several months.
You're listening to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service with me, Helena Merriman. We're asking, can Islamic State be defeated in Iraq? The stonings and beheadings that make global headlines are just one part of the story of the places they control. They're also building new souks, installing power lines and running food kitchens. They even have a consumer protection office. It's a costly strategy, but they've got the money to do it. Begging the question, can Islamic State be defeated by attacking their finances?
This is going to take time.
Pentagon spokesman John Kirby on Islamic State.
Even after the hits they've taken, and they have been hit, they still have financing at their fingertips. This is just the beginning.
Part 3. Money.
It's time to meet our third expert witness.
So my name is Loretta Napoleoni. I was born in Rome.
Loretta Napoleoni studies how extremist militants get their money and advises governments on how to cut it off. She's interviewed members of the Palestinian Liberation Organization as well as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. She spoke to me from the slightly incongruous location of a ski resort in Montana, where she's finishing a book about, yes, you've guessed it, Islamic State.
You know what I write? I have a huge sitting room overlooking the lake. And this is also where I interview these guys via Skype, so sometimes it's weird that you're sitting there, this absolutely idyllic vision outside your window, and you're talking to those guys that tell you the most horrible things.
And why do they tell you?
Because they're very proud of what they're doing. They think this is very clever. I mean, there is a narcissistic element, very, very strong in these individuals. These are people that want to change the world. So they want the world to know that they exist. They want the world to know how clever they are.
So let's look at Islamic State. How new is their financial model?
Islamic State has conquered a very large territory where there are important resources. So inside that territory, the Islamic State is running the economics of the country, following a sort of, closed economy model. All the money move in cash, they have their own banking system, they have their own transfer system inside the territory. So that gives them a tremendous power. So we've never seen anything like that until now. This is the first time.
Do we know from which source Islamic State gets more of its funding from? Is it through the oil or is it through taxes?
I think it gets it through taxes because it taxes the oil also.
So is your point that even if all the oil smuggling routes were to be blocked, that wouldn't really make much of a difference?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it would make much of a difference.
Nor would cutting funding from Saudi Arabia or Qatar. She says Islamic State took money from private donors in those countries to get started. But now the group is self-sufficient. To get an idea of how they make their money, take a look at Raqqa, a town in northern Syria on the banks of the Euphrates River, where Islamic State has declared its capital.
they actually rebuilt the infrastructure which had been destroyed during the civil war, and that gave impetus to the economy. And of course people pay taxes, and through this taxation the Islamic State funds its own activity. This is what we don't understand, is that this organization is not an organization that wants to destroy, as it was Al-Qaeda before. It wants to build something, so it wants to build a state. And in order to build a state that is sufficiently stable, you need consensus. And what it's seeking is the consensus of the population. So yes, once I conquer a town, I'm going to show you that I can run this town better than anybody before, the various dictators, for example, or the oligarchic elites, because I want your consensus. I want you to say, yes, I want to be part of the caliphate. This is what we're missing. We're missing this key political modern element.
It's worth pausing here. The world is faced with a radical, militant organisation operating like a state with a cash flow that can't be blocked. Loretta Napoleoni thinks that leaves only one answer.
The strength, let's say, the economic and financial strength of this organization is the fact that they control a state. So we have to destroy the state. We have to remove them from the territorial position where they are. So I don't think we can find a solution unless we commit to a full-fledged war. A war fought in the trenches and a war fought on the ground.
A war fought on the ground. She's in agreement with General Richards there. But we've also heard that a war can only be won if the Iraqi army is well equipped and unified, which at the moment it isn't. So do we need to ask a different question here? Should we be asking whether there's something about the Iraqi state itself that has allowed IS to thrive?
Part 4. A radical solution.
The Iraqis all voted on a constitution of a united Iraq, and this is what all communities want.
That's a spokesman for the Iraqi Prime Minister in the days following the fall of Mosul. Is he right? Do Iraqis still want a united country? Here's our final expert witness.
I'm Abbas Kadhim. I was born in Babylon, Iraq, raised in Najaf in central Iraq, went to college in Mosul. That's in the north.
Abbas Kadhim's teenage years were dominated by the war between Iraq and Iran, where over 1 million people were killed.
So every day you would sit and you just count coffins coming back, draped with the Iraqi flag.
As a Shia, he experienced the hardship of life under Saddam Hussein's Sunni-dominated regime. He took part in the Shia uprising of 1991, in which tens of thousands died. He then fled to America, where he lives now, making regular trips back to Iraq.
Currently, I am a senior foreign policy fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies for Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C.
Baghdad isn't the city he knew as a boy. Shia banners fly from buildings and squares, but bitterness over the past makes it hard to persuade some Shia that they should risk their lives to fight Sunni extremists like IS in the Sunni heartland.
The Shia seem to see that either their sons are being killed in previous wars under the past regimes, or now they are being killed in car bombs, and even when they go to defend a Sunni city, they end up being captured by the population and beheaded. So in my last visit to Iraq last month, what I found was very new to me. For the first time, I sensed a deep lack of commitment among the young Iraqi Shia, and quite frankly, even those who are not so young, to the idea of Iraq staying together, because they see it as pointless.
Abbas Kadhim says there's talk now of a new Shia republic.
People say, well, let's have all of the Shia provinces carved out of Iraq and establish this republic, because the Shia are the least who need the unity of Iraq. They have Basra with all of the oil, they have Amara with oil, they have their religious places, and they don't need anything from everybody else.
But do you think there is the political imagination and the political will to make that happen, to bring about a disintegration of the Iraqi state?
Definitely at the popular level, it is ready. The question here is to have the politicians acknowledge it and sign on it. They are not with enough courage to say, well, let's save people all of this blood and agony and suffering, and let's just face reality and have an amicable breakdown of this country into three components if they cannot live together in peace. If it is going to happen no matter what, then the sooner the better.
You can hear the weariness in his voice. Talk to a Sunni, though, and you'll hear resentment too, about being locked out of top jobs and barred from cabinet meetings, about the institutional and psychological segregation hardwired into the state of Iraq since it was created in 1916, bringing together Sunni, Shia and Kurds. So is it time for some fundamental rethinking? Haven't we learnt by now, after spending more than $1 trillion in Iraq, that uniting the various different groups, Sunni, Shia, Kurds, secularists, is just not achievable? Perhaps the emergence of Islamic State provides an opportunity to rethink the Iraqi nation-state.
I actually agree with that assessment.
Ali Kaderi.
I think the best thing that could occur at this point to help stabilize the region is the redrawing of some of the borders.
Yes, absolutely. I think the best solution would be to partition Iraq in a way that people can administer their own territory.
I think that's something that we need to think through.
It's not simple, it's not easy, it'll be bloody, it'll be time-consuming, it'll be resource-intensive.
There'll be plenty of people say that it's not necessary, but at the very minimum, I think you've got to look at a much more federal solution for Iraq.
Federalism, partition, dangerous words. And it's not just our expert witnesses using them. American Vice President Joe Biden is pushing for what he calls functioning federalism. The new Iraqi president, Haider al-Abadi, has said that he wants Iraqi provinces to have more power. So how does this answer our original question? Can Islamic State be defeated? Some say that federalism would draw Sunni support away from Islamic State. Others want full partition, which could be bloody. Neither is a quick-fix solution for ridding Iraq of IS. But all our expert witnesses argue that unless the fundamental problems of the Iraqi nation-state itself are addressed, there can be no durable victory against Islamic State.
The Inquiry is produced in London by Charlotte Pritchard and me, Neil Rizal. We want to know what you want to know, so demand an inquiry. Send your questions to the World Service Facebook page or message us on Twitter at BBC The Inquiry.